I'm going to go over how to add a modal contact form to the product page in Shopify. You can see I've got my dummy product right here, and in this case I'm using the minimal theme by Shopify, but there's not really anything theme specific or even Shopify specific about this. This is just basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can see I've added this question button right here. You click on it, our modal form comes up, and if you click the X or click outside of the box, modal form goes away. That's about it. Let's go ahead and get started. So within my theme files, I'm going to start by adding a new snippet. Let's go ahead and call that product modal contact form. Just good convention, good naming convention is if you're building something that's going to go on the product page, you want to preface or prefix product to the beginning of that. So let's go ahead and create that. And then within the snippet, I typically need to go ahead and create the HTML first. I usually add HTML, the basic HTML and CSS, so that I can see what it's going to look like before I go back and add the JavaScript. I just tend to be very visual that way. So in this case, the first thing that we would need is going to be the button. And we'll say questions. And I'm going to give it a class of BTN, which I think is what Shopify usually uses for the basic button styling. And then we need to go into the product page templates, which I think in this case is in these sections. Yep. And I'm going to include this button right below the product form. So let's do a search for end form. Yeah, here's our product form, and then right below this, we just need to render the snippet that we just created. So that was product modal contact form. And then if we look at our page, we should have a button. Let's take a look. Yeah, we've got a button right here. Doesn't actually do anything, but we have a button. So the next thing that we can do is to begin actually creating the modal window. And if you'll remember, there were a couple things going on. You click the questions button, and then the modal window comes out, but you also noticed there was a dark overlay behind the modal, which kind of just removes focus from your regular page and puts the focus on the actual modal window content. So let's go back to our code. We'll go back to our snippet, and we'll begin just building that overlay and the modal content. One other thing, I'm just going to, for now, put all of my style and my HTML and my JavaScript in this snippet. If this was going into a site that was going to be in production, I would probably go ahead and separate them once I was finished everything. Separate the CSS and the JavaScript into the appropriate files. But for now, just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to keep it all within the same file. So let's say style. And our script. Whoops. So first I want to create the dark overlay, and I'm just going to create this within its own div. And I'm going to add a class to it. I'll just call it modal contact dark overlay. And I'm going to close that div. And then within our styles, we can go ahead and create the styles needed to show that overlay. And let's go ahead and give that an opacity of 0.7. And I'm not going to style the modal too much in this tutorial, but I will add just some basic styling and some basic animation. In this case, I think we'll make the opacity sort of fade in, and we'll give the actual modal window itself a little bit of a drop-in effect. So um, let's call that animate opacity. Let's go ahead and give that half a second. And then below that, we're going to add our keyframes and the name. And we'll say RGBA 0, 0. Two. And let's go ahead and save that. Oh, and it looks like I made an error. Can save that. And now if we save it and we take a look at our theme, we'll see, yeah, now we have this dark overlay across the whole screen at this point. So at this point, we can go ahead and create the basic modal form. To do that, I'm going to create a div that will basically hold the form. So that's going to be div class. We'll call that contact modal container. And then within that div, we'll have the actual modal. So we'll call that div class contact modal. And then within the modal, we know we're going to have two things. We're going to have a H1 title, and we're going to have an exit button. So let's go ahead and create the exit button. And let's call that contact modal exit. And then also we want to say contact us. So you can see the content is coming in right here. Now we just need to add styling to the modal form so that it shows correctly. The first thing is going to be to add the styling to the container. So let's say, and that's going to have basically the same styling as the overlay. This is just what's going to hold the actual modal so that we can position it properly. So and then we can add the modal styling. And we'll give it a width of 30%. With a white background. We'll give that a position relative, and let's say top, we want it to be 25%. If we take a look, we can see we've got it, but it's right up here. So let's go ahead and say margin. And I'm just going to copy and post some animation styles that I already have, so that once we have it working, it adds a little bit of bounce to the modal. Also a little bit of padding and box shadow. And let's specify height auto. Oh, and let's rearrange that a little bit. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we've got, we do have a modal window. It's at the very top right now because we have our transform property in there because we're going to use that with our animation, but so far that looks pretty good. I'm going to add in my keyframes. And let's address the button, make sure that's positioned correctly. So position. A little bit farther. That looks pretty good. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is add my form content. So let's create another div for that. We'll call that contact modal form content. And in order to get our form, we're actually going to go to our regular contact form. And here is the code for our contact page form. We can actually go ahead and just copy this entire section right here, starting from form all the way down to end form. Copy that. And we are going to drop that into that div. So save that and let's see what that looks like. Okay. So it looks like we got our form content, although our positioning's a little messed up. So let's go ahead and fix that. For now, I'm just going to go back up to the transform, and I'm going to make that plus 25. And then once we're ready to implement the animation, we can go back and fix that. So that looks a little bit better, and we need to, looks like, expand our padding of the form. Maybe make that 30. Nope. Make that 40. Maybe a little bit more. We'll go ahead and make it 50. And that doesn't look too bad. So okay, yeah. So there's our basic form. It's not too bad. I think what I'll do also is add some default fields in here, just for better user experience. We might want to add the product title here, or we might also want to add the product SKU just for internal reference, just so that when the customer contacts you, they know, you know exactly what they're talking about. If you need to do any research beforehand, you can do that before coming back to them. So let's go ahead and add that. So it looks like we can probably just go ahead and copy this and paste that. And then here we'll call this, we'll just call it artwork. It can be whatever name you want that to be as long as the label matches the input ID. And we can leave that as label hidden. But here I'll go ahead and say product title. And then down here, we want to replace this with whatever field we want to show on the form when we receive it. So in this case, we're just going to say artwork. And we're not going to have a value in this case, or excuse me, we're not going to have a placeholder in this case. We're just going to go ahead and have a value. And that value is going to be just the product title. Oh, and I see a mistake I made up here. And we don't need, we can just get rid of the auto capitalize. We already have a value, so we can get rid of all of that. And get rid of the rest of that. Oops. Go ahead and save that. We'll see what that looks like. Ah, okay. Yeah, and so there you see it pre-filled our product name. Just for some additional styling, I might want to go ahead and disable. I might want to go ahead and disable that. So I think that I think we can use just a read-only property. Let me see. Okay, yeah, and so that goes ahead and takes away the ability to actually edit that. It's purely optional, of course, but it might just be something where you wanted to pre-fill that information without allowing the user to change it. So, okay. And next, I think that I would also, I might just also add a SKU, in case internally you want whoever's receiving the contact form to be able to quickly look up what the user is referring to. So let's go ahead and just copy this again that we just did. Go ahead and add that, and then we can go ahead and make this a SKU. And here, I don't think we can't just say SKU. I think we need to use the selected or first available variant.sku. Let's see if we'll see if that works. Go ahead and copy that. Drop that here. and see if that worked. Yeah, okay, cool. So you've got your title, you've got your SKU. These are both read-only. Um, I might also want to, add a style where I make the background a little bit gray, or I make the text a little bit gray, just to show that it's something that's not meant to be edited. You can take away the autofocus. That's just additional styling. So that looks pretty good. We've got our modal, we've got our form content, obviously, we have our submit button, we have our exit button. Nothing, of course, works right now, but I think it appears like that's all the information that we need. So now we can begin to go ahead and start to implement the JavaScript. So let's go back. Okay. Down in our script, and this is just going to be some basic DOM manipulation. The first thing we need to do is to show the overlay. So let's go ahead and make that display none. And we're going to copy the name that we need. And we're going to call document.querySelector. And let's go ahead and break that all out into separate functions. And we'll call this show overlay. And save that. And then we'll create a separate one for show modal. And now if I could also have just made one big div, this one for modal contact arc overlay. I could have dropped everything into that. But for dealing with the animation, I just found it easier to separate that out and to make this one a completely separate div. But if I had left everything in there, I only would have needed one function down below. But it's just a different way of going about it. So let's copy this. We'll call this show modal. And then we're going to need to pull our contact modal container. And of course, we need to go back to our container and give that a display of none. So then if we go back to our theme, yeah, we'll see that there's no, we'll see that the modal has actually gone away. Button still doesn't do anything, but yeah, so now the modal and the overlay are both hidden. And while we're here, let's just go ahead and create two more functions that will hide the overlay and hide the modal. So we'll copy those and we'll say hide overlay and hide modal. And these are going to be display none. So now all we need to do is add an onClick function. So here's our button. We want that button to trigger these two, to execute these two functions here, show overlay and show modal. So let's go ahead and detail out what we're doing. So this will open the modal window. And we just need to add a click event to our button. And for that, let's go ahead and add an ID to the button. And we'll call this contact modal button. And so down here in our query selector, and then on click, we want to and then within our on click, we want to show overlay, and we want to show modal. Save that. And so now if we check out our theme, we should be able to click questions and you'll see that the overlay works and the modal comes up. We just can't get rid of it yet, but you can see that it's at least appearing. So let's work on getting rid of it. If we go back, we can create, I'm going to close the modal window. And here we actually need to add two functions because we want the user to be able to get rid of the modal by clicking the X here, but we also want the user to be able to get rid of the modal by clicking anywhere on the backgrounds here. So we're just going to create two separate functions for that. The first one will close the window by clicking on the X, so that's going to be, let's find what we called the X. Class contact modal exit. And I made that a class. I'm actually going to make that an ID. And I'll include the code at the end and in the notes, so you can just copy the final product. But down here, we're going to grab that button. And we'll say on click. And we're just going to add these two functions from above. Oops, we don't want to show it, we want to hide it. So let's try that out. We open, oh, our button moved because we changed the class to an ID, but we didn't change the style, so we'll fix that in a second. But we click it and we get rid of it. So that's working the way we want it to. So let's fix our style. Right here. And that looks better. So, okay, so we can click the button to show the modal. We can click the X to get rid of the modal, but we also want the user to be able to click anywhere outside the box to close the modal as well. So let's go ahead and add that. So to do that, I'm just going to do window on click equals function events. And we want to say if the event target equals the modal container. So that's going to be contact modal container. And it might be easier to break modal container out into additional variables, but for now I'll just keep it in the document query selector code like so. And if that's true, we want to basically repeat these tasks right here, hide overlay and hide modal. So let's see if that works. We click on our button, we get our modal. We click our X, we get rid of the modal. We click outside of it and it closes. And we can still click within the form without it closing. So that looks like it's working. So now let's go ahead and test our form just to see what happens when we submit it. I'll say and we'll say ahoy. So we submit that. It takes us to our Google CAPTCHA. Submit that, and it takes us back to our page, but we don't really have any confirmation that the form actually submitted. We can open this back up and we see, oh, it looks like the form did actually submit. Oh, and there's our email right up here. Email looks pretty good. You can see we've got our artwork, we've got our SKU, and then the rest of the regular form content. But back to this, it's not really the best user experience that we don't get this confirmation message unless we open the modal back up. So let's look at how we can actually make it so that this message automatically comes back up once the form is submitted and the page reloads. And that being said, I should mention probably a more elegant way of doing this would be to use Ajax so that you don't have any kind of page refresh. But there's a few other things that requires. You'd have to use your own CAPTCHA if you want to use that. So for this video, we're just going to focus on submitting this without using any additional Ajax, and maybe that's something I can include in a future video. So let's think about how we can automatically open the form back up. I think another good another way of improving this might be just to get rid of all of this information and get rid of the submit button as long as this this form comes back up, this message comes back up. It's probably not necessary otherwise. So if you'll notice that when you have a contact form on a page in Shopify, this right up here, contact posted equals true, that gets addended to your URL. So one way of handling this is to use JavaScript to actually get your current URL and to check to see if the URL contains this language right here, this contact posted true. And if so, you are going to automatically open up that modal on page load. And something else you can also do is use conditional logic to say, if it does include this language right here, let's not show any of these fields or submit button, just to get rid of that and just so the user doesn't have to see all of that again. So let's look at how we can do that if we go back to our code. And let's go ahead and make a comment about that so we know what we were doing. We'll say close the modal window by clicking outside the box. And up here we'll say close the modal window by clicking the X. Okay. So first of all, let's create a function that hides all of basically we want to hide the form fields. If our new URL that we're going to get with JavaScript, if that URL contains that message success information, we want to hide the fields. So if we scroll back up, we'll see that we have this div, contact modal form content. And I think that what we can do is we can just grab this div right here, and we can create another, perhaps create another class, which we'll call hide form content, and by whenever the URL contains that message, we'll go ahead and add that class. So let's try that. So we're going to call that hide modal. We could even call it just hide modal form fields. Well, actually, we'll call it hide modal content. And give that a display none. And then down in our JavaScript, we're going to create a function that will specify the form content and basically just hide that form content. So we'll call it hide form fields. Actually, we want that to be our action. So let's put that down here. Say class list.add. And what was the name again? Hide modal content. Okay. And so now we basically just want logic that says if the URL contains this message, we want to automatically open this again. We want to not show any of the fields. We want to not show the send button, but we do want to show this success message. So let's take a look at how we can do that. We've just created a function that will essentially hide the form when executed, but the success message, if we take a look here, we can see that the success message is actually, it's actually a part of the form. So we can actually just go ahead and we're going to take the success message and we can go ahead and delete the rest of this information, because we're going to be employing our own logic to determine if the form submitted successfully. So outside of here, we're going to just create P, and we'll call this modal success message. Modal success. So this is our liquid contact form post success message. And basically one of the things that we'll do is we'll update the inner HTML of this so that we go ahead and post that message. So we're going to create a function that executes, before we were creating on click events. In this case, it's going to be on page load. So in order to do that, we can say window dot onload equals function. And then we want to say if the URL contains that specific message. So we can just use a simple if statement and say if window dot location dot href includes whatever our success message was, contact posted, and then we can begin to list the different functions that we want to execute. So we know that we want to execute the hide form fields. We know that we want to show the overlay. We know that we want to show the modal. And finally, two more things. We want to get rid of the submit button. Oh, actually, no, we don't. That's actually included as part of the form, so we don't need to do that. Then the only thing we need to do is update the success message. So we can find our modal success message, and we'll say document.query selector and we want the inner HTML to equal the liquid success message. So let's save that and check that out. And it looks like I forgot a parentheses. Save that. And take a look. Yeah, and it looks like our message updated so that now we can just see, thanks for contacting us, we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And that pops up on the page reload. So basically the user has some kind of confirmation that the form posted successfully. And then if we go into our URL and we remove that added message, we should get the regular form. Yep, there we go. That wraps up the form functionality. I'll take a minute and add just some additional basic styling, just so that there's a little bit of dynamic feeling towards when the user is using the modal. I'll go ahead and remove. I don't really like the way that button looks. I think it'd be better just to have an X. And when we open the modal, you can see that there's a little bit of fading already. It might also be nice to have the modal descend a little bit or fade in or have some kind of movement on it. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at how to do that. For my exit button, I should just be able to add border none, background none, and I might want to increase the font size a little bit. So let's try 18px to see how that looks. That looks pretty good. And if I would also want to rearrange this so that the button, move this over and up. So let me see what I can do to adjust the location of the button. We've got our contact modal button ID right here. And looking at this, there's a few other places where I've used CSS classes where I might want to use IDs instead, because it's content that we're not going to be, it doesn't look like we'll be reusing elsewhere. So that's probably one way I'd go back and refactor my code, but I'll just leave it as is for now and make some updates in the code that I could post along with the video. So to move the position of the contact modal button, let me see. Let's give it a position relative, and we'll give it a black background just to make it a little bit different. And then as far as the button, nope, let's try that again. Just move that over a little bit. And I might give it a min width just to make sure it doesn't shrink. Let's try 50px. Oh, it's not taking that. Let's try percentage. That looks pretty good. So we'll take those styles and transfer them back to our And so now I think the only thing that I would like to see is maybe some movement with the modal content form. I think it'd be nice if maybe it descended a little bit when it appears in a view, maybe give it a little bit of bounce. So let's take a look at how we can do that. Okay. So I paused the video for a second and actually added a couple animation behavior to the form. So you can see here I've done animation, I've called it drop in, 5-second duration, and I've added a cubic bezier. And then down here we have our keyframes, and we're going from top of 10% to top of 25%. Save that, and then we look at our modal. We see that there's a little bit of a descend and then a little bounce at the bottom. So that about wraps it up. Hopefully this is helpful to anyone who's looking for a solution to this problem. As I said, I'll post my code below. If anyone has any tips or recommendations for better ways of going about this, please let me know. But I'll just leave it at that. Thanks. Just a quick update. As I thought about this, I thought perhaps using the success message URL was not the best way of handling this, only because if that URL were to change in the future, that could cause your success message not to show. And so I thought perhaps a better way of handling the success message was to actually use Shopify's form objects form.posted successfully attribute, which will return true if the form is submitted successfully. You'll recall that was actually in the original form that we modified. So if we go back to the code, in order to implement that, all I've done was created a liquid variable, form success. I've given it an initial value of false. Then within the form, I've changed the value to the attribute form.posted successfully, which if it does post successfully will turn to true. And then I've taken our liquid variable and I've taken out the window location and I've just substituted in our liquid variable. And that should work correctly the same way it was working before. Hope that helps. Thanks.